In the southwest of Ireland, about 100 kilometres away from Cork, is the small seaside town of Schull. Bathed by the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, Schull has attracted the attention of many outsiders looking for a peaceful place to gather their thoughts and feel inspired. This is what French native Sophie Toscan du Plantier felt the first time she set foot in the Irish town. What she didn't know was that in 1996, a few years after buying her cottage there, she would be murdered in the place she felt most at peace. The mysterious crime led way to speculation, conspiracies, and all sorts of secrets among the locals, as well as questionable police work that destroyed what little evidence could be used to solve the mystery. Despite there being a main suspect, Ian Bailey was never officially charged due to lack of evidence, meaning the murder of Sophie has never been officially solved. Today on the back of the archive, we're telling the story of the unsolved murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. Sophie Bugnaud was born on July 28, 1957 in Paris. She came from a wealthy French family, and from a young age she was involved in the film industry and became a television producer. Her involvement would be even more important when she married Daniel Toscan du Plantier, a well-established French film producer. The couple celebrated their wedding in 1991 and lived together in Paris, along with Sophie's teenage son from her first marriage. Sophie was a young, impulsive woman. She knew what she wanted and worked hard to get it, never letting anyone walk over her. She believed in justice and never losing sight of her morals to get where she wanted to be. She feared nothing, and those who met her would value the strength in her, especially her son, whom she had with her first husband. Sophie and Pierre-Louis were very close. Being her only child, Sophie kept him very close, and the two were very involved in each other's lives. Their life in Paris was always in the spotlight, since both Sophie and her husband worked as television and film producers. They were constantly on sets, at award shows, or promoting their latest production. This hectic lifestyle wasn't for everyone, and to escape the chaos and find some peace and quiet, Sophie would often hop on a plane and go to the place she truly felt at home, Schull. Although it only had around 600 residents, Schull was a very popular destination among foreigners. Located west of Cork, its charm and isolation spoke to a community of writers and artists who found inspiration in its solitude and breathtaking environment. Sophie had spent many summers of her childhood in this town and always found herself wanting to stay longer. So in 1993, she bought an isolated cottage and would often go there with her family to spend weekends, holidays, or any time available. Her family wasn't always fond of the cottage. It was too isolated and hard to find. The heating wasn't reliable and there were sometimes power cuts, but Sophie loved it. It wasn't rare for her to also go there alone, to escape the madness of Paris and recharge her soul. This is what she did in December of 1996. On December 20th, 1996, Sophie landed at Cork Airport by herself. She was planning on spending the Christmas holidays in her cottage, far from work and life in Paris. She made her way to her isolated home and during the next couple of days was seen around town running errands, talking to the local business owners, and living the quiet life she liked living when she was there. Sophie had a great relationship with the locals, many of which knew her since she was a girl, and would spend her summers there with her family. Some still referred to her as Sophie Bugnaud, her maiden name. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary during those days leading up to Christmas, and nobody could imagine what would happen in a peaceful town like Schull. At around 10 a.m. on the morning of December 23, 1996, Shirley Foster phoned the police. A body was lying dead outside the home of her neighbour Sophie Toscan du Plantier on the lane that led to her house. The victim seemed to be the French woman herself, but her face was too disfigured to recognize immediately. The Garda, the Irish police, arrived at the scene shortly after the call and made a first inspection of the area. The victim, who was indeed Sophie, was wearing a dressing gown over pajamas, but she was wearing boots, meaning she knew she would be walking outside. Next to her body was a concrete block with blood on it. possibly the murder weapon. Traces of blood were found on the gate and the path all the way up to the back door, where the keys were still in the lock from the inside. 2 wine glasses were on the drying rack, and nothing was out of place, suggesting whatever happened took place outside. Although the police investigated the scene early on, the state pathologist in charge of examining Sophie's body did not arrive at the scene until 28 hours after the body was discovered. 28 hours in which the body was left outside in the cold and the rain, covered only by a few plastics, leaving important traces and evidence to be washed away and contaminated by the humidity. This was the beginning of a questionable police investigation that potentially turned this into an unsolved case. Sophie's body, once examined, revealed defense wounds and scratches on her hands. She had sustained blows to the back of her head and her face. She was barely recognizable. However, an accurate time of death couldn't be provided. The body had been out in the cold for more than a day, making it impossible to determine when this tragedy had taken place. The scene didn't reveal much either. Apart from the traces of blood found on the gate and the back door, nothing suggested any kind of fight inside the house. The fact that Sophie was wearing her boots over her pajamas suggested she knew she had to come out for something. The keys left on the back door meant she was either only stepping out for a moment or was lured out by someone or something. The 2 wine glasses in the kitchen didn't prove a second person was at home, since they were on the drying rack and could be accumulated by Sophie from the previous day. The clues left at the scene were next to none, but of all the blood samples collected, only 1 didn't belong to Sophie. DNA testing in 1996 was very premature, but it was the only lead they had, so with such a weak trail of evidence left at the scene, police started tracing Sophie's steps since arriving at her cottage to build a timeline of events. On December 21st, the day after arriving at Schull, Sophie had been seen in town shopping, where she spoke to several locals. One of the shop owners told the police she noticed a man wearing a black coat and hat who was watching Sophie while she was in her shop. After she had left, the man had followed her. On December 22nd, the evening before she was found dead, Sophie had gone for a walk to 3 Castle Head, a remote trail near Schull with a breathtaking view that includes the ruins of Dunlow Castle, dating back to the 13th century. This area is also the home of a popular local legend about the White Lady, the spirit of a heartbroken bride who threw herself off the cliff top after finding out her father had shot and killed her new husband in a case of mistaken identity on their wedding day. The legend says she roams the area still in her wedding gown, and having an encounter with her means something tragic is about to happen. During her walk on December 22nd, Sophie claimed to have seen the White Lady and told her friends all about it later when she went to pay them a visit. She was scared. She truly believed she had an encounter with a ghost. After seeing her friends, she went back to the local pub for tea and chatted to some neighbors. Then, at about 6 p.m, she went back home to her isolated cottage. The last contact anyone had with Sophie was around midnight, when she was on the phone to her husband Daniel, who was in Paris. Then, sometime during midnight and 10 a.m. when her neighbor found her, someone killed Sophie Toscan du Plantier. The first thought of the police was to investigate Daniel Toscan du Plantier. The couple was in the process of separating, since Sophie had discovered that Daniel was having an affair. However, Sophie was also having an affair, but had decided to end it just before this trip. This was one of the reasons she had decided to travel alone to Schull for the holidays, to get away from her painful separation. However, both Daniel and the man Sophie was having an affair with were in France, and nowhere near Ireland during the night of December 22nd. The police continued to investigate and tried to follow the few leads they had. Meanwhile, the Christmas celebrations of the neighbours at Schull were filled with speculation about the case. The locals blamed the tourists, but the police felt differently. This seemed to be the work of someone local, someone who knew the roads to Sophie's remote cottage. Finally, after gathering testimonies and conducting interviews all around town, the police narrowed down the investigation to one man, Ian Bailey. Although he was born in Manchester, England, Ian Bailey had lived in Ireland since 1991. After his marriage ended and his ex-wife started a family with another man, his mental health took a turn, and he fell into depression. Like many others, he was drawn to Schull, seeking a quiet life, and the proximity to Cork allowed him to continue working in his passion, journalism. For years, Ian worked as a freelance journalist, selling stories to different media outlets in Ireland and England. Meanwhile, he enjoyed the small-town lifestyle and had built a life in Schull. The neighbours, however, weren't all fond of him. Many thought of him as overconfident and even arrogant. He often portrayed himself as a poet and an artist, and his urge to be the centre of attention wasn't always appreciated. Ian Bailey lived with Jules Thomas, another Schull local, and the two lived together at her house. On the morning of December 23rd, Ian and Jules heard about a body being found, and they made their way to the crime scene to get all the information to write a story. Officers at the scene told them there was no information to be given at the time, but Ian was known for being a thorough journalist, and he would do whatever it took to gather information and write stories he could sell. This was the first murder in Schull in 100 years, and with the victim being somewhat of a celebrity in France, the story was bound to attract a lot of interest from international media. And so Ian began writing about the crime, using testimonies from neighbours and other sources he could find. He even visited the crime scene with the excuse of delivering groceries to Sophie's neighbour. Stories about Sophie's case began to pop up, and the details in them became more and more specific. Through these stories, it seemed that Ian knew a lot about Sophie's case, but also about Sophie herself. An article titled Sophie's Tangled Love Life speculated about her affairs, whether she had someone over that night, and how she had been inviting different men over to the cottage for a long time. Sophie's family were quick to set the record straight about all the gossip. Sophie was having an affair, but only with one man, and the two had broken off the affair just before her trip that Christmas. These stories sparked gossip around town, but they also attracted the interest of investigators. How did Ian know so much about Sophie? Ian claimed he had never been introduced to Sophie. He only knew her from seeing her around town occasionally. However, other neighbours insisted that Ian and Sophie had been introduced before. Ian continued to write about the crime scene and sell information to other media outlets, and began speculating about this being a hitman job from Daniel, Sophie's ex-husband, to avoid losing money in a divorce and cash out a life insurance policy. Daniel was still in France during the investigation. He said he was too devastated to travel, so police were not able to speak to him. However, the hitman theory didn't fit in with the crime itself. Sophie was violently killed with a concrete block left at the scene. Police thought if this were a job done by a professional, it would have been much more discreet. Police were still convinced that whoever did this had to know the area. Sophie's cottage was very isolated, and the roads to get there were not easy. There were a lot of back roads to be taken, and they were especially hard to navigate at night, unless you knew exactly where you were going. Due to the lack of evidence, the police were relying heavily on neighbours' testimonies and looking for any witnesses they could find. That's when a key testimony in this case would give them the lead they needed. On January 11th, an anonymous tip came in about a man being seen at a bridge near Sophie's house at 3 a.m. on December 23rd. He was wearing a black coat and hat, similar to the man the shop owner had seen on December 21st following Sophie. Following up on this testimony, the Garda discovered that the anonymous tip had come from Marie Farrell, the owner of the shop. She had given the tip anonymously because she was at the bridge with the man she was having an affair with, and didn't want her husband to find out. Through her description and other witness testimonies, police identified the man as Ian Bailey, who became the main suspect. A couple of days after the murder, Ian had been interviewed and seen with scratches on his arms and face, but he told the police they were the result of him cutting down a Christmas tree. Since no photos of these injuries were ever taken, they could not be evaluated again after naming him a suspect. Ian told police the same thing he was writing in his stories, the theory of the hitman hired by Sophie's ex-husband, but police were more and more convinced that this was the work of someone local. After watching him closely and trying to build a case against him with no luck and no evidence to back it up, the police arrested Ian Bailey on February 10, 1997. His home was searched and remains of a fire were found in his yard. A neighbor reported having seen smoke coming from his house a few days after the murder. Ian, however, mentioned there had been a fire in early December. No evidence tying him to the murder was found at his house or studio. Jules Thomas, Ian's partner, was also arrested and questioned. She stated that the night of the murder, she and Ian had been at the local pub, and after closing, they drove through the valley and stopped at a viewpoint. From there they saw Sophie's and the neighbours' lights were on. While they looked over, Ian had mentioned he had the feeling something bad was going to happen that night. Jules said that after that they got in the car and drove home. However, while Ian stated that he had been in bed all night, Jules said he had actually woken up in the middle of the night because he had a deadline to meet. When confronted about this inconsistency, Ian changed his story and he said he went to the studio. Jules didn't see him until 9 a.m. the next morning, and she noticed he had a wound on his face. However, she said that wound could have been there before, since it was near his hairline, and she may have just noticed it at that moment. All of this was not physical evidence, and nothing tied him to the scene. So after being held for 12 hours, he was let go. The newspapers, however, were now reporting him as the main suspect, and this made him furious. He wasn't in control of the media narrative anymore. His mental health also seemed to take a hit. While police continued their investigation with a close eye on him, the locals reported seeing Ian howling at the moon or carrying a stick he claimed gave him magical powers. Each new report coming out was more speculative than the other, and some neighbors said that Ian had even confessed to certain people that he had indeed killed Sophie, only to brush it off as dark humor later. As time went by, investigators seemed to be no closer to solving the murder, and were still focusing all efforts on trying to prove that Ian had killed Sophie. So on January 27, 1988, Ian Bailey was arrested again in the hopes that he would eventually confess by making him think they had evidence against him. But the truth was, there was hardly any evidence left. The traces of blood left at the scene returned no other matches and had been heavily contaminated. The body had been left out in the cold, destroying any realistic timeline and traces. And other pieces of evidence had been lost, including the huge gate from Sophie's house, which had traces of blood on it too. The DPP were still reviewing the case and couldn't formally charge Ian, so the police were trying to get a confession out of him. However, he maintained his innocence, and with no charges to be made, he once again had to be let go after 12 hours. Since this was the second time he had been held but not charged with anything, the police had no third chance to do so again. According to the Irish law, a person can only be arrested and held twice without a charge. If there's still no formal charge after the second time, they cannot be arrested again. Instead of waiting to have evidence against him, the police tried to pressure the confession out of Ian, putting the system in his favor and placing him as the victim. Although many believed Ian had done it, he invited the press to his home after the second arrest to give a statement about his innocence and the witch hunt against him.
I gave a sample of hair. I had hair pulled from as did my partner, and we gave it. It was made absolutely certain to me by all my interrogating officers that I was the murderer. They had no doubt. They knew it was me. They just needed me to confess. If they had evidence, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wouldn't have been released.
Yeah. Well,
I know I'm innocent. I have nothing to do with this killing.
Did you kill? Vous l'avez tué?
No.
The police were heavily criticized for the handling of this investigation, and after these two failed attempts at getting a confession, the case began to grow cold. No new information or evidence came up after that, and the investigation was slowly dying down. Ian sued several news outlets in 2003 for defamation, but with the help of witnesses and police files, Ian lost the trial. Not only that, but all the police files became public, and people were able to see in detail why police suspected of him. Although it was all circumstantial evidence, these files made the public more and more inclined to believing that Ian had taken part in this murder, and the trial had become more about the murder case and not the defamation. Ian Bailey had gone in thinking he was going to set the record straight with the trial, but all it led to was more suspicion about his involvement in Sophie's case. During the trial, Marie Farrell was called in to give her statement about seeing Ian twice and even facing threats from him to change her statement. Ian's relationship with Jules also came up. Ian had assaulted Jules 3 times, 6 months before Sophie was killed. Jules defended him, saying he was just stressed and drunk, but the public image of Ian was that of a violent man. After Ian lost the trial against the media, the public believed it was just a matter of time before he was charged with Sophie's murder. But the DPP announced there was no evidence tying Ian to the crime scene or the murder, and therefore, he would not be charged. Sophie's family was not happy with the outcome, and requested Ian be prosecuted in France, since the law there gave way to charge him even with just circumstantial evidence. Irish law requires to be convicted beyond reasonable doubt. France, however, doesn't. In 2008, they requested all the files be transferred to the French justice system and to hold a trial against Ian without his presence, because Ireland would not extradite him due to lack of evidence to be tried in France. In another twist of events, 10 years after Marie Farrell had given her statement about seeing Ian on the bridge, and reconfirming it again during the trial with the media, she retracted it. She said she did see a man that night and had tried to give the tip anonymously, since she herself was with another man that night and didn't want word getting out. However, she said that the police were able to trace the call to her and paid her a visit. They pressured her to say it was Ian she saw on the bridge, and out of fear of being caught, she had said it was him. She also said that Ian never threatened her to retract her statement. It had all been a lie.
I am telling the truth now. Why would I put myself in the spotlight like this if I wasn't telling the truth?
During the whole investigation, the police failed to help the case. The Garda failed to properly investigate the crime scene, lost and contaminated evidence, and failed to properly investigate all suspects. There had even been recordings of police admitting to be gearing the evidence in the investigation to point at Ian, although no evidence confirmed their theories. In November of 2014, Ian Bailey sued the Irish state for being wrongfully targeted for Sophie's murder by the police. Ian's legal team centered their strategy around Marie Farrell's retracted statements to prove that she was influenced by the police into giving Ian's name. However, when Marie took the stand and was asked to give the name of the person she was with that night, she refused and even got up and left the courtroom. She had to be chased around the building, and when she got back to the courtroom, the judge warned her if she didn't give the name of the man she was with, there would be consequences, since she was under oath. She gave the name of a man, but it was not the truth. This situation cost Ian the trial, since Marie was his main witness, and her credibility went downhill after this performance. Ian lost the case against the state. In 2019, the French trial without Ian's presence began. Sophie's son went to Schull to talk to the neighbours about how the trial in France wanted to restore the name of the town his mother had loved so deeply and try to find justice for Sophie. There would be no jury, just 3 judges. Over 30 witnesses were called in, and finally, within the French law, Ian was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. A European arrest warrant was issued for him for the murder and assault of Sophie. In 2020, the High Court of Ireland once again confirmed there was no sufficient evidence to extradite him, and Ian could remain in Ireland if he wished. However, he cannot leave the country since his arrest warrant is international. If he were to visit any other country in Europe, he would be arrested upon arrival and sent to France. So as of today, he remains in Ireland. In the summer of 2022, a unit in the Irish police dedicated to reviewing crimes said they would conduct a full review of the unsolved murder, and in July of 2022, they confirmed they had a new lead to identify the man who followed Sophie out of the shop in 1996. The suspect is an associate of Daniel, Sophie's late husband. The Irish and French police will be working together to investigate further and try to discover if this man was in any way involved in Sophie's murder. Sophie's son still visits Schull and misses his mother immensely. 25 years later, the wound of her loss still hasn't healed, and until this case is solved, it will be hard to put this tragic story behind him.